Welcome to Personal History. I'm your host, Matt Staehle. In this episode, we're going to look at the life of a family that was shaped greatly by the development of the trucking industry in the 20th century, starting with the military adapting motor vehicle transportation before World War I, all the way up through the great boom of trucking in the 1940s and 1950s. As opposed to some of the other stories we told that are smaller in scale, this is a little bit more of a long story covering the family from the beginning to almost the end of the century. I hope you enjoy. If you like videos like this about history, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much. This is the story of Arthur and Mary Staehle. Arthur Jacob Staehle Sr. was born in Newark, New Jersey, April 27th of 1892. He was the son of German immigrants. His father had immigrated from Prussia and was a diamond cutter in New York City. Mary Josephine Murphy was born in England in 1894, but was actually Irish. Arthur grew up with what would be considered a pretty normal childhood for the late 19th century. He grew up in the Newark, New Jersey area. Along with his father, he was in and out of New York City up until he was finishing high school, at which point he enlisted in the Army. In the course of his service with the Army, he was deployed to the Philippines, and there he had his first encounter with operating motor vehicles, which were at that time completely brand new and very limited. But he took an immediate interest in it, and soon became one of the first truck drivers in U.S. Army history. He served in the Philippines and then was coming back to the United States right about the time that World War I broke out. As the war broke out, he was due to end his enlistment, but he was asked to stay. The Army recognized that although most of their operations were still reliant on horses, the truck was going to be an increasingly large part of their operations, and with Arthur being one of the few people that had intimate knowledge and experience with operating Army trucks, they wanted him to stay on and train new soldiers as they were coming in and then being sent to Europe. So he served throughout the duration of World War I, although he stayed stateside as a trainer, up until the time the war ended, at which time he was released from service. Arthur's wife, born Mary Josephine Murphy, was born September 29, 1894 in England, but her family was Irish. This is because of kind of an interesting family aside. Her parents were John Thomas Murphy and Sarah Ann Hughes. They were originally from County Mayo in Ireland, but fled the country ahead of bootlegging charges and a warrant that was out for their arrest, and stayed in England for 16 years until the warrant expired. This is the point where Mary was born. There's a legend, although it's hard to verify if it's a legend or just a good Irish myth, that as they were being chased, they kicked over all their stills to destroy the evidence, and it emptied into a nearby creek that the local cows drank from, and a lot of the cows ended up getting quite drunk. Although Mary grew up in Ireland, she wasn't very fond of her situation there, and in 1911, at the age of 16 years old, she decided to move from Ireland to the United States without telling any of her family, and just up and moved. She boarded the SS Campania and made it to Ellis Island. After being processed for a couple of days, she was admitted in and ended up living in New York City. Not having many other skills, she decided to get work as a cook and soon found a restaurant/bar that would hire her on and also had rooms for rent upstairs. In somewhat stereotypical Irish fashion, one of the first things she bought was a bucket and a rope, and she would put money in the bucket, lower it down with the rope, and swing it against the back door of the bar. The bartenders, who obviously knew who she was, would take the money out, put a bottle of whiskey in, and she would wheel it back up. Arthur and Mary met in 1916 while he was still in the Army and began dating. In 1917 they were married, and although married, they were still separated for another few months until the war ended, and he was discharged from the Army in 1918 with his training duties no longer needed. After being discharged from the Army, they settled in together, and by November of 1918 had started a family with the birth of my grandfather, Arthur Jacob Staehle Jr. That was followed by a daughter, Margaret, another son, Daniel, and finally another daughter, Patricia Ann. Beginning in 1920, Arthur was able to put his truck driving skills back to use again, as he was hired on as one of the first truck drivers with Carnegie Trucking Corporation, which was based in the New York, New Jersey area, as well as doing deliveries into further stretching regions in Pennsylvania and the other parts of the Atlantic seaboard. He ended up working for them for 35 years from 1920 until 1955. During that time, they raised their family in New Jersey, and coming in the following years with World War II, his sons went off to war. Then returned home. All through it, he continued as a truck driver and eventually became also a trainer as he trained more and more truck drivers, particularly ones who, ironically, were now coming back from yet another world war, who had previous experience operating military vehicles, although this time on a much greater scale than before. Following the end of World War II, Arthur and Mary ended up with different roles themselves as they moved from being parents onto the roles of being grandparents as their children began having children in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Arthur's job was beginning to change as well. Although he still drove trucks on a somewhat regular basis, he was more and more utilized as a trainer and operating in an administrative role with Carnegie Trucking, who had been with essentially since their inception. He was still doing truck driving trips into certain areas he was very familiar with, particularly in and around New Jersey and Pennsylvania. It was on one of these routine trips that he'd taken many, many times before, in this case to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where what seemed like a normal event would take a tragic turn that would define the final chapter of Arthur's life. While far more advanced than the trucks he had originally operated in the Philippines and in training in World War I, trucks in the 1950s still lacked many of the redundancies and safety systems we come to expect as normal today. To complete this, the best way to do it is to actually recount the nomination and award that was given by the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission. Arthur J. Staehle Sr., 63, truck driver, saved an indeterminate number of persons from a runaway truck in Allentown, Pennsylvania on January 25, 1955. While driving his trailer truck on a heavily traveled thoroughfare in a business and residential district, Staehle began ascending a hill which had a steep upgrade for 800 feet. The drive shaft assembly broke, the brakes failed to function, and the fully loaded truck weighing 27 tons began coasting backward, steadily gaining speed. Staehle stepped partly from the cab to the running board and, glancing over his shoulder, steered the truck close to the curb. Although unable to see beyond the rear of the trailer, he guided the truck 600 feet down the hill and past homes adjoining the street. Attaining a speed of at least 30 miles per hour, the truck became increasingly hard to handle, the trailer veering sharply away from the curb. As Staehle guided the truck an additional 300 feet to a level section of the street, the trailer swung around and struck a utility pole. Staehle was thrown into the air and landed on his head on the pavement. He was knocked unconscious and rolled 15 feet. Running into a vacant lot, the truck jackknifed and came to a stop without overturning. Staehle suffered head injuries and was disabled and in the hospital for 12 weeks. While initially released from the hospital after 12 weeks, Arthur had sustained injuries that caused him to go back into medical care repeatedly and eventually took his life in May of 1956 with long-term injuries that were resultant from the crash. Following Arthur's passing, Mary remained in the home they had built their family in together and became the matriarch of the Staehle family for many decades to come. She eventually passed away in May of 1980 at the age of 85. Arthur had sustained injuries that caused him to go back into medical care repeatedly and eventually took his life in May of 1956 with long-term injuries that were resultant from the crash. Following Arthur's passing, Mary remained in the home they had built their family in together and became the matriarch of the Staehle family for many decades to come. She eventually passed away in May of 1980 at the age of 85.